Don't forget to subscribe. Afterwards, the wisest and most spiritual books from the greatest authors await you every day. And now buckle up, sit back and we'll begin. Carlos Castaneda. Book 6. Eagle's Gift. Prologue. Although I am an anthropologist, this is not strictly an anthropological work. Yet it has its roots in cultural anthropology, for it began years ago as field research in that discipline. I was interested at that time in studying the uses of medicinal plants among the Indians of the southwest and northern Mexico. My research evolved into something else over the years as a consequence of its own momentum and of my own growth. The study of medicinal plants was superseded by the study of a belief system, which seemed to cut across the boundaries of at least two different cultures. The person responsible for this shift of emphasis in my work was a Yaqui Indian from northern Mexico, Don Juan, who later introduced me to Don Juan, a Mazatec Indian from central Mexico. Both of them were practitioners of an ancient knowledge, which in our time is commonly known as sorcery, and which is thought to be a primitive form of medical or psychological science, but which in fact is a tradition of extremely self-disciplined practitioners and extremely sophisticated praxis. Praxis translating an idea into action. The two men became my teachers rather than my informants, but I still persisted, in a haphazard way, in regarding my task as a work in anthropology. I spent years trying to figure out the cultural matrix of that system, perfecting a taxonomy, a classificatory scheme, a hypothesis of its origin and dissemination. All were futile efforts in view of the fact that in the end, the compelling inner forces of that system derailed my intellectual pursuit and turned me into a participant. Under the influence of these two powerful men, my work has been transformed into an autobiography, in the sense that I have been forced from the moment I became a participant to report what happens to me. It is a peculiar autobiography because I am not reporting about what happens to me in my everyday life as an average man, nor am I reporting about my subjective states generated by daily living. I am reporting, rather, on the events that unfold in my life as a direct result of having adopted an alien set of interrelated ideas and procedures. In other words, the belief system I wanted to study swallowed me, and in order for me to proceed with my scrutiny, I have to make an extraordinary daily payment: my life as a man in this world. Due to these circumstances, I am now faced with the special problem of having to explain what it is that I am doing. I am very far away from my point of origin as an average Western man or as an anthropologist. And I must first of all reiterate that this is not a work of fiction. What I am describing is alien to us, therefore, it seems unreal. As I enter deeper into the intricacies of sorcery, what at first appeared to be a system of primitive beliefs and practices has now turned out to be an enormous and intricate world. In order to become familiar with that world and to report about it, I have to use myself in increasingly complex and more refined ways. Whatever happens to me is no longer something I can predict, nor anything congruous with what other anthropologists know about the belief systems of the Indians of Mexico. I find myself, consequently, in a difficult position. All I can do under the circumstances is present what happened to me as it happened. I cannot give any other assurance of my good faith, except to reassert that I do not live a dual life, and that I have committed myself to following the principles of Don Juan's system in my everyday existence. After Don Juan and Don Juan, The two Mexican Indian sorcerers who tutored me had explained their knowledge to me to their own satisfaction. They said goodbye and left. I understood that from then on my task was to assemble by myself what I had learned from them. In the course of fulfilling this task, I went back to Mexico and found out that Don Juan and Don Genero had 9 other apprentices of sorcery, 5 women and 4 men. The oldest woman was named Soledad, the next was Maria Elena, nicknamed La Gorda. The other 3 women, Lydia, Rosa, and Josefina, were younger and were called the Little Sisters. The 4 men, in order of age, were Eligio, Benigno, Nestor, and Pablito. The latter 3 men were called the Generos because they were very close to Don Genero. I had already known that Nestor, Pablito, and Eligio, who was no longer around, were apprentices, but I had been led to believe that the 4 girls were Pablito's sisters and that Soledad was their mother. I knew Soledad slightly over the years and had always called her Doña Soledad as a sign of respect since she was closer to Don Juan in age. Lydia and Rosa had also been introduced to me, but our relationship had been too brief and casual to afford me an understanding of who they really were. I knew La Gorda and Josefina only by name. I had met Benigno but had no idea that he was connected to Don Juan and Don Genero. For reasons that were incomprehensible to me, all of them seemed to have been waiting in one way or another for my return to Mexico. They informed me that I was supposed to take the place of Don Juan as their leader, their Nagual. They told me that Don Juan and Don Genero had disappeared from the face of the earth, and so had Eligio. The women and the men believed that the 3 of them had not died. They had entered another world, different from the world of our everyday life, yet equally real. The women, especially Doña Soledad, clashed violently with me from our first meeting. They were, nevertheless, instrumental in producing a catharsis purging of emotional tensions in me. My contact with them resulted in a mysterious effervescence in my life. From the moment I met them, drastic changes took place in my thinking and my understanding. All this did not happen, however, on a conscious level. If anything, after my first visit to them, I found myself more confused than ever. Yet in the midst of the chaos, I encountered a surprisingly solid base. In the impact of our clash, I found in myself resources I had not imagined I possessed. La Gorda and the 3 little sisters were consummate, having a revealing supreme mastery or skilled dreamers. They voluntarily gave me pointers and showed me their accomplishments. Don Juan had described the art of dreaming as the capacity to utilize one's ordinary dreams and transform them into controlled awareness by virtue of a specialized form of attention which he and Don Genero called the second attention. I expected that the 3 Generos were going to teach me their accomplishments in another aspect of Don Juan's and Don Genero's teachings, the art of stalking. The art of stalking was introduced to me as a set of procedures and attitudes that enabled one to get the best out of any conceivable situation. But whatever the 3 Generos told me about stalking did not have the cohesion or the force I had anticipated. I concluded that either the men were not really practitioners of that art, or they simply did not want to show it to me. I stopped my inquiries in order to give everyone a chance to feel relaxed with me, but all of the men and women sat back and trusted that since I was no longer asking questions, I was finally behaving like a Nagual. Each of them demanded my guidance and counsel. In order to comply, I was obliged to undertake a total review of everything Don Juan and Don Juan had taught me to go deeper still into the art of sorcery. Part 1. The Other Self. 1. The fixation of the second attention. It was mid-afternoon when I got to where Lagorda and the little sisters lived. Lagorda was alone, sitting outside by the door, gazing into the distant mountains. She was shocked to see me. She explained that she had been completely absorbed in a memory, and for a moment, she had been on the verge of remembering something very vague that had to do with me. Later that night, after dinner, Lagorda, the three little sisters, the three generos, and I sat on the floor of Lagorda's room. The women sat together. For some reason, although I had been with each one of them an equal length of time, I had isolated Lagorda as the recipient of all my concern. It was as if the others did not exist for me. I speculated that perhaps it was because Lagorda reminded me of Don Juan while the others did not. There was something very easy about her. Yet that easiness was not so much in her actions as it was in my feelings for her. They wanted to know what I had been doing. I told them that I had just been in the city of Tula, Hidalgo, where I had visited some archaeological ruins. I had been most impressed with a row of 4 colossal, column-like figures of stone, called the Atlanteans, which stand on the flat top of a pyramid. Each one of the almost cylindrical figures, measuring 15 feet in height and 3 feet across, is made of 4 separate pieces of basalt carved to represent what archaeologists think are Toltec warriors carrying their war paraphernalia. 20 feet behind each of the front figures on the top of the pyramid, there is another row of 4 rectangular columns of the same height and width as the first, also made of 4 separate pieces of stone. The awe-inspiring setting of the Atlanteans was enhanced by what a friend, who had guided me through the site, had told me about them. He said that a custodian of the ruins had revealed to him that he had heard the Atlanteans walking at night, making the ground underneath them shake. I asked the generos for comments on what my friend had said. They acted shy and giggled. I turned to Lagorda, who was sitting beside me, and asked her directly for her opinions. "I've never seen those figures," she said. "I've never been in Tula. Just the idea of going to that town scares me." "Why does it scare you, Gorda?" I asked. "Something happened to me in the ruins of Monte Alban in Oaxaca," she said. "I used to go to roam around those ruins even after the Nagual Juan made us told me not to set foot in them. I don't know why, but I loved that place. Every time I was in Oaxaca I would go there. Because women alone are always harassed, I would usually go with Pablito, who is very daring. But once I went there with Nestor. He saw a glitter on the ground. We dug a little and found a strange rock that fit in the palm of my hand. A hole had been neatly drilled into the rock. I wanted to put my finger through it, but Nestor stopped me. The rock was smooth and made my hand very hot. We didn't know what to do with it. Nestor put it inside his hat and we carried it as if it were a live animal. All of them started to laugh. There seemed to be a concealed joke in what Lagorda was telling me. "Where did you take it?" I asked her. "We brought it here to this house," she replied, and that statement elicited uncontainable laughter from the others. They coughed and choked laughing. "The joke is on Lagorda," Nestor said. "You've got to understand that she's mule-headed like no one else. The Nagual had already told her not to fool around with rocks or bones or any other thing she might find buried in the ground. But she used to sneak behind his back and get all kinds of crap. That day in Oaxaca she insisted on carrying that god-awful thing. We got on the bus with it and brought it all the way to this town, and then right into this room. The Nagual and Genero had gone on a trip, Lagorda said. I got daring and put my finger through the hole and realized that the rock had been cut to be held in the hand. Right away I could feel the feeling of whoever had held that rock. It was a power rock. My mood changed. I became frightened. Something awesome began to lurk in the dark, something that had no shape or color. I couldn't be alone. I would wake up screaming, and after a couple of days I couldn't sleep anymore. Everybody took turns keeping me company, day and night. When the Nagual and Genero came back, Nestor said, the Nagual sent me with Genero to put the rock back in the exact place where it had been buried. Genero worked for 3 days to pinpoint the spot. And he did it. What happened to you, Gorda, after that? I asked her. The Nagual buried me, she said. For 9 days I was naked inside a dirt coffin. There was another explosion of laughter among them. The Nagual told her that she couldn't get out of it, Nestor explained. Poor Gorda had to piss and shit inside her coffin. The Nagual pushed her inside a box that he made with branches and mud. There was a little door on the side for her food and water. The rest of it was sealed. Why did he bury her? I asked. That's the only way to protect anyone, Nestor said. She had to be placed under the ground so the earth would heal her. There is no better healer than the earth. Besides, the Nagual had to fend off the feeling of that rock which was focused on Lagorda. The dirt is a screen. It doesn't allow anything to go through either way. The Nagual knew that she couldn't get worse by being buried for 9 days. She could only get better. Which she did. How did it feel to be buried like that, Gorda? I asked. I nearly went crazy, she said. But that was just my indulging. If the Nagual hadn't put me in there, I would have died. The power of that rock was too great for me. Its owner had been a very large man. I could tell that his hand was twice the size of mine. He held on to that rock for dear life, and in the end someone killed him. His fear terrified me. I could feel something coming at me to eat my flesh. That was what the man felt. He was a man of power, but someone even more powerful got him. The Nagual said that once you have an object of that kind, it brings disaster because its power enters into challenges with other objects of its kind, and the owner becomes either a pursuer or a victim. The Nagual said that it is the nature of such objects to be at war, because the part of our attention which focuses on them to give them power is a very dangerous, belligerent part. Lagorda is very greedy, Publito said. She figured that if she could find something which already had a great deal of power in it, she'd be a winner because nowadays no one is interested in challenging power. Lagorda assented with a movement of her head. I didn't know that one could pick up other things besides the power that the objects have, she said. When I first put my finger through the hole and held the rock, my hand got hot and my arm began to vibrate. I felt truly strong and big. I'm sneaky so no one knew that I was holding the rock in my hand. After a few days of holding it, the real horror began. I could feel that somebody had gone after the owner of the rock. I could feel his fright. He was doubtlessly a very powerful sorcerer, and whoever was after him wanted not only to kill him, but to eat his flesh. That really scared me. I should have dropped the rock then, but the feeling I was having was so new that I kept the rock clutched in my hand like a damn fool. When I finally dropped it, it was too late. Something in me was hooked. I had visions of men coming at me, men dressed in strange clothes. I felt they were biting me, tearing the flesh of my legs with sharp little knives and with their teeth. I went berserk. How did Don Juan explain those visions? I asked her. He said that she no longer had defenses, Nestor said. And because of that she could pick up that man's fixation, his second attention which had been poured into that rock. When he was being killed he held on to the rock in order to gather all his concentration. The Nagwal said that the man's power went out of his body into his rock. He knew what he was doing. He didn't want his enemies to benefit by devouring his flesh. The Nagwal also said that the ones who killed him knew this. That's why they were eating him alive, to get whatever power was left. They must have buried the rock to avoid trouble. And Lagorda and I, like two idiots, found it and dug it up. Lagorda shook her head affirmatively 3 or 4 times. She had a very serious expression. The Nagwal told me that the second attention is the most fierce thing there is, she said. If it is focused on objects, there is nothing more horrendous. What's horrible is that we cling, Nestor said. The man who owned the rock was clinging to his life and to his power, that's why he was horrified at feeling his flesh eaten away. The Nagwal said that if the man would have let go of his possessiveness and abandoned himself to his death, whatever it may have been, there wouldn't have been any fear in him. The conversation faded. I asked the others if they had anything to say. The little sisters glared at me. Benigno giggled and hid his face with his hat. Pablito and I have been in the pyramids of Tula, he finally said. We've been in all the pyramids there are in Mexico. We like them. Why did you go to all the pyramids? I asked him. I really don't know why we went to them, he said. Perhaps it was because the Nagwal Juan Matus told us not to. How about you, Pablito? I asked. I went there to learn, he replied huffily, and laughed. I used to live in the city of Tula. I know those pyramids like the back of my hand. The Nagwal told me that he also used to live there. He knew everything about the pyramids. He was a Toltec himself. I realized then that it had been more than curiosity that made me go to the archaeological site in Tula. The main reason I had accepted my friend's invitation was because at the time of my first visit to Lagorda and the others, they had told me something which Don Juan had never even mentioned to me, that he considered himself a cultural descendant of the Toltecs. Tula had been the ancient epicenter of the Toltec Empire. What do you think about the Atlanteans walking around at night? I asked Pablito. Sure, they walk at night, he said. Those things have been there for ages. No one knows who built the pyramids. The Nagwal Juan Matus himself told me that the Spaniards were not the first to discover them. The Nagwal said there were others before them. God knows how many. What do you think those 4 figures of stone represent? I asked. They are not men, but women, he said. That pyramid is the center of order and stability. Those figures are its 4 corners. They are the 4 winds, the 4 directions. They are the foundation, the basis of the pyramid. They have to be women, mannish women, if you want to call them that. As you yourself know, we men are not that hot. We are a good binding, a glue to hold things together, but that's all. The Nagwal Juan Matus said that the mystery of the pyramid is its structure. The 4 corners have been elevated to the top. The pyramid itself is the man supported by his female warriors, a male who has elevated his supporters to the highest place. See what I mean? I must have had a look of perplexity on my face. Pablito laughed. It was a polite laughter. No. I don't see what you mean, Pablito, I said. But that's because Don Juan never told me anything about it. The topic is completely new to me. Please tell me everything you know. The Atlanteans are the Nagual. They are dreamers. They represent the order of the second attention brought forward. That's why they're so fearsome and mysterious. They are creatures of war but not of destruction. The other row of columns, the rectangular ones, represent the order of the first attention, the tonal. They are stalkers. That's why they are covered with inscriptions. They are very peaceful and wise, the opposite of the front row. Pablito stopped talking and looked at me almost defiantly, then he broke into a smile. I thought he was going to go on to explain what he had said, but he remained silent as if waiting for my comments. I told him how mystified I was and urged him to continue talking. He seemed undecided, stared at me for a moment, and took a deep breath. He had hardly begun to speak when the voices of the rest of them were raised in a clamor of protest. The Nagual already explained that to all of us, Lagorta said impatiently. What's the point of making him repeat it? I tried to make them understand that I really had no conception of what Pablito was talking about. I prevailed on him go on with his explanation. There was another wave of voices speaking at the same time. Judging by the way the little sisters glared at me, they were getting very angry, especially Lydia. We don't like to talk about those women, Lagorta said to me in a conciliatory tone. Just the thought of the women of the pyramid makes us very nervous. What's the matter with you people? I asked. Why are you acting like this? We don't know, Lagorta replied. It's just a feeling that all of us have, a very disturbing feeling. We were fine until a moment ago when you started to ask questions about those women. Lagorta's statements were like an alarm signal. All of them stood up and advanced menacingly toward me, talking in loud voices. It took me a long time to calm them and make them sit down. The little sisters were very upset, and their mood seemed to influence Lagorta's. The three men showed more restraint. I faced Nestor and asked him bluntly to explain to me why the women were so agitated. Obviously I was unwittingly doing something to aggravate them. I really don't know what it is, Nestor said. I'm sure none of us here knows what is the matter with us, except that we all feel very sad and nervous. Is it because we're talking about the pyramids? I asked him. It must be, Nestor replied somberly. I myself didn't know that those figures were women. Of course you did, you idiot, Lydia snapped. Nestor seemed to be intimidated by her outburst. He recoiled and smiled sheepishly at me. Maybe I did, he conceded. We're going through a very strange period in our lives. None of us knows anything for sure anymore. Since you came into our lives, we are unknown to ourselves. A very oppressive mood set in. I insisted that the only way to dispel it was to talk about those mysterious columns on the pyramids. The women protested heatedly. The men remained silent. I had the feeling that the men were affiliated in principle with the women, but secretly wanted to discuss the topic just as I did. Did Don Juan tell you anything else about the pyramids, Pablito? I asked. My intention was to steer the conversation away from the specific topic of the Atlanteans, and yet stay near it. He said one specific pyramid there in Tula was a guide, Pablito replied eagerly. From the tone of his voice I deduced that he really wanted to talk. And the attentiveness of the other apprentices convinced me that covertly all of them wanted to exchange opinions. The Nagwal said that it was a guide to the second attention, Pablito went on, but that it was ransacked and everything destroyed. He told me that some of the pyramids were gigantic not doings. They were not lodgings but places for warriors to do their dreaming and exercise their second attention. Whatever they did was recorded in drawings and figures that were put on the walls. Then another kind of warrior must have come along, a kind who didn't approve of what the sorcerers of the pyramid had done with their second attention, and destroyed the pyramid and all that was in it. The Nagwal believed that the new warriors must have been warriors of the third attention, just as he himself was. Warriors who were appalled by the evilness of the fixation of the second attention. The sorcerers of the pyramids were too busy with their fixation to realize what was going on. When they did, it was too late. Pablito had an audience. Everyone in the room, myself included, was fascinated with what he was saying. I understood the ideas he was presenting because Don Juan had explained them to me. Don Juan had said that our total being consists of two perceivable segments. The first is the familiar physical body which all of us can perceive. The second is the luminous body, which is a cocoon that only seers can perceive, a cocoon that gives us the appearance of giant luminous eggs. He had also said that one of the most important goals of sorcery is to reach the luminous cocoon, a goal which is fulfilled through the sophisticated use of dreaming and through a rigorous systematic exertion he called not doing. He defined not doing as an unfamiliar act which engages our total being by forcing us to become conscious of its luminous segment. In order to explain these concepts, Don Juan made a three-part, uneven division of our consciousness. He called the smallest a first attention, and said that it is the consciousness that every normal person has developed in order to deal with the daily world. It encompasses the awareness of the physical body. Another larger portion he called the second attention, and described it as the awareness we need in order to perceive our luminous cocoon and to act as luminous beings. He said that the second attention remains in the background for the duration of our lives, unless it is brought forth through deliberate training or by an accidental trauma. He said the second attention encompasses the awareness of the luminous body. He called the last portion, which was the largest, the third attention, an immeasurable consciousness which engages undefinable aspects of the awareness of the physical in the luminous bodies. I asked him if he himself had experienced the third attention. He said that he was on the periphery of it, and that if he ever entered it completely, I would know it instantly because all of him would become what he really was, an outburst of energy. He added that the battlefield of warriors was the second attention, which was something like a training ground for reaching the third attention. The second attention was a state rather difficult to arrive at, but very fruitful once it was attained. The pyramids are harmful, Pablito went on, especially to unprotected sorcerers like ourselves. They are worse yet to formless warriors like Lagorda. The Nagwal said that there is nothing more dangerous than the evil fixation of the second attention. When warriors learn to focus on the weak side of the second attention, nothing can stand in their way. They become hunters of men, ghouls. Even if they are no longer alive, they can reach for their prey through time, as if they were present here and now, And because prey is what we become if we walk into one of those pyramids, the Nagwal called them traps of the second attention. What exactly did he say would happen? Lagorda asked. The Nagwal said that we could stand perhaps one visit to the pyramids, Publito explained. On the second visit we would feel a strange sadness. It would be like a cold breeze that would make us listless and fatigued, a fatigue that soon turns into bad luck. In no time at all we'll be jinxed. Everything will happen to us. In fact, the Nagwal said that our own streaks of bad luck were due to our willfulness in visiting those ruins against his recommendations. Eligio, for instance, never disobeyed the Nagwal. You wouldn't catch him dead in there. Neither did this Nagwal here, and they were always lucky while the rest of us were jinxed, especially Lagorda and myself. Weren't we even bitten by the same dog? And didn't the same beams of the kitchen roof get rotten twice and fall on us? The Nagwal never explained this to me, Lagorda said. Of course he did, Publito insisted. If I had known how bad it was, I wouldn't have set foot in those damn places, Lagorda protested. The Nagwal told every one of us the same things, Nestor said. The problem is that every one of us was not listening attentively, or rather every one of us listened to him in his own way and heard what he wanted to hear. The Nagwal said that the fixation of the second attention has two faces. The first and easier face is the evil one. It happens when dreamers use their dreaming to focus their second attention on the items of the world, like money and power over people. The other face is the more difficult to reach, and it happens when dreamers focus their second attention on items that are not in or from this world, such as the journey into the unknown. Warriors need endless impeccability in order to reach this phase. I said to them that I was sure that Don Juan had selectively revealed certain things to some of us and other things to others. I could not, for instance, recall Don Juan ever discussing the evil face of the second attention with me. I told them then what Don Juan said to me in reference to the fixation of attention in general. He stressed to me that all archaeological ruins in Mexico, especially the pyramids, were harmful to modern man. He depicted the pyramids as foreign expressions of thought and action. He said that every item, every design in them, was a calculated effort to record aspects of attention which were thoroughly alien to us. For Don Juan, it was not only ruins of past cultures that held a dangerous element in them. Anything which was the object of an obsessive concern had a harmful potential. We had discussed this in detail once. It was a reaction he had to some comments I had made about my being at a loss as to where to store my field notes safely. I regarded them in a most possessive manner and was obsessed with their security. What should I do? I asked him. General once gave you the solution, he replied. You thought, as you always do, that he was joking. He never jokes. He told you that you should write with the tip of your finger instead of a pencil. You didn't take him up on that because you can't imagine that this is the not doing of taking notes. I argued that what he was proposing had to be a joke. My self-image was that of a social scientist who needed to record everything that was said and done in order to draw verifiable conclusions. For Don Juan, the one thing had nothing to do with the other. To be a serious student had nothing to do with taking notes. I personally could not see a solution. Don Genero's suggestion seemed to me humorous, not a real possibility. Don Juan argued his point further. He said that taking notes was a way of engaging the first attention in the task of remembering, that I took notes in order to remember what was said and done. Don Juan's recommendation was not a joke because writing with the tip of my finger on a piece of paper, as the not doing of taking notes, would force my second attention to focus on remembering, and I would not accumulate sheets of paper. Don Juan thought that the end result would be more accurate and more powerful than taking notes. It had never been done as far as he knew, but the principle was sound. He pressed me to do it for a while. I became disturbed. Taking notes acted not only as a mnemonic device, such as a rhyme or acronym, used to aid recall device, but soothed me as well. It was my most serviceable crutch. To accumulate sheets of paper gave me a sense of purpose and balance. When you worry about what to do with your sheets, Don Juan explained, you are focusing a very dangerous part of yourself on them. All of us have that dangerous side, that fixation. The stronger we become, the more deadly that side is. The recommendation for warriors is not to have any material things on which to focus their power, but to focus their power on the spirit, on the true flight into the unknown, not on trivial shields. In your case, your notes are your shield. They won't let you live in peace. I seriously felt that I had no way on earth to disassociate myself from my notes. Don Juan then conceived of a task for me in lieu of a not doing proper. He said that for someone who was as possessive as I was, the most appropriate way of freeing myself from my notebooks would be to disclose them, to throw them in the open, to write a book. I thought, at the time, that that was a bigger joke than taking notes with the tip of my finger. Your compulsion to possess and hold on to things is not unique, he said. Everyone who wants to follow the warrior's path, the sorcerer's way, has to rid himself of this fixation. My benefactor told me that there was a time when warriors did have material objects on which they placed their obsession, and that gave rise to the question of whose object would be more powerful, or the most powerful of them all. Remnants of those objects still remain in the world, the leftovers of that race for power. No one can tell what kind of fixation those objects must have received. Men infinitely more powerful than you poured all the facets of their attention on them. You have merely begun to pour your puny worry on your notes. You haven't gotten yet to other levels of attention. Think how horrible it would be if you would find yourself at the end of your trail as a warrior, still carrying your bundles of notes on your back. By that time the notes will be alive, especially if you learn to write with your fingertip and still have to pile up sheets. Under those conditions it wouldn't surprise me in the least if someone found your bundles walking around. It is easy for me to understand why the Nagual Juan Matus didn't want us to have possessions, Nestor said after I had finished talking. We are all dreamers. He didn't want us to focus our dreaming body on the weak face of the second attention. I didn't understand his maneuvers at the time. I resented the fact that he made me get rid of everything I had. I thought he was being unfair. My belief was that he was trying to keep Pablito and Benigno from envying me because they had nothing themselves. I was well off in comparison. At the time, I had no idea that he was protecting my dreaming body. Don Juan had described dreaming to me in various ways. The most obscure of them all now appears to me as being the one that defines it best. He said that dreaming is intrinsically the not doing of sleep. And as such, dreaming affords practitioners the use of that portion of their lives spent in slumber. It is as if the dreamers no longer sleep, yet no illness results from it. The dreamers do not lack sleep, and the effect of dreaming seems to be an increase of waking time, owing to the use of an alleged extra body, the dreaming body. Don Juan had explained to me that the dreaming body is sometimes called the double or the other, because it is a perfect replica of the dreamer's body. It is inherently the energy of a luminous being, a whitish, phantom-like emanation, which is projected by the fixation of the second attention into a three-dimensional image of the body. Don Juan explained that the dreaming body is not a ghost and is as real as anything we deal with in the world. He said that the second attention is unavoidably drawn to focus on our total being as a field of energy and transforms that energy into anything suitable. The easiest thing is, of course, the image of the physical body with which we are already thoroughly familiar from our daily lives and our use of our first attention. And that which channels the energy of our total being to produce anything that might be within the boundaries of possibility is known as will. Don Juan could not say what those boundaries were, except that at the level of luminous beings, the range is so broad that it is futile to try to establish limits. Thus, the energy of a luminous being can be transformed through will into anything. The Nagwal said that the dreaming body gets involved and attaches itself to anything, Benigno said. It doesn't have sense. He told me that men are weaker than women because a man's dreaming body is more possessive. The little sisters agreed in unison with a movement of their heads. Lagorda looked at me and smiled. The Nagwal told me that you're the king of possessiveness, she said to me. Genero said that you even say goodbye to your turds before you flush them down. The little sisters rolled down on their sides laughing. The Generos made obvious efforts to contain themselves. Nestor, who was sitting by my side, patted my knee. The Nagwal and Genero used to tell great stories about you, he said. They entertained us for years with tales about a weird guy they knew. We know now that it was you. I felt a wave of embarrassment. It was as if Don Juan and Don Genero had betrayed me, laughing at me in front of the apprentices. Self-pity took over. I began to complain. I said out loud that they had been predisposed to be against me, to think that I was a fool. That's not true, Benigno said. We are delighted that you are with us. Are we? Lydia snapped. All of them became involved in a heated argument. The men and the women were divided. Lagorda did not join either group. She stayed sitting by my side, while the others had stood up and were shouting. We're going through a difficult time, Lagorda said to me in a low voice. We've done a lot of dreaming, and yet it isn't enough for what we need. What do you need, Gorda? I asked. We don't know, she said. We were hoping that you would tell us that. The little sisters and the Generos sat down again in order to listen to what Lagorda was saying to me. We need a leader, she went on. You are the Nagwal, but you're not a leader. It takes time to make a perfect Nagwal, Pueblito said. The Nagwal Juan Matus told me that he himself was crappy in his youth until something shook him out of his complacency. I don't believe it, Lydia shouted. He never told me that. He said that he was very crummy, Lagorda added in a low voice. The Nagwal told me that in his youth he was a jinx, just like me, Pueblito said. He was also told by his benefactor not to set foot in those pyramids, and because of that he practically lived there until he was driven away by a horde of phantoms. Apparently no one else knew the story. They perked up. I had completely forgotten about that, Pueblito explained. I've only just remembered it now. It was just like what happened to Lagorda. One day after the Nagwal had finally become a formless warrior, the evil fixations of those warriors who had done their dreaming and other not doings in the pyramids came after him. They found him while he was working in the field. He told me that he saw a hand coming out of the loose dirt in a fresh furrow to grab the leg of his pants. He thought that it was a fellow worker who had been accidentally buried. He tried to dig him out. Then he realized that he was digging into a dirt coffin. A man was buried there. The Nagwal said that the man was very thin and dark and had no hair. The Nagwal tried frantically to patch up the dirt coffin. He didn't want his fellow workers to see it, and he didn't want to injure the man by digging him out against his will. He was working so hard that he didn't even notice that the other workers had gathered around him. By then the Nagwal said that the dirt coffin had collapsed and the dark man was sprawled on the ground, naked. The Nagwal tried to help him up and asked the men to give him a hand. They laughed at him. They thought he was drunk having the DTs because there was no man, or dirt coffin, or anything like that in the field. The Nagwal said that he was shaken, but he didn't dare tell his benefactor about it. It didn't matter because at night a whole flock of phantoms came after him. He went to open the front door after someone knocked and a horde of naked men with glaring yellow eyes burst in. They threw him to the floor and piled on top of him. They would have crushed every bone in his body had it not been for the swift actions of his benefactor. He saw the phantoms and pulled the Nagwal to safety to a hole in the ground which he always kept conveniently at the back of his house. He buried the Nagwal there while the ghosts squatted around waiting for their chance. The Nagwal told me that he had become so frightened that he would voluntarily go back into his dirt coffin every night to sleep long after the phantoms had vanished. Pablito stopped talking. Everyone seemed to be getting ready to leave. They fretted and changed position as if to show that they were tired of sitting. I then told them that I had had a very disturbing reaction upon hearing my friend's statements about the Atlanteans walking at night in the pyramids of Tula. I had not recognized the depth at which I had accepted what Don Juan and Don Genero had taught me until that day. I realized that I had completely suspended judgment, even though it was clear in my mind that the possibility those colossal figures of stone could walk did not enter into the realm of serious speculation. My reaction was a total surprise to me. I explained to them at great length that the idea of the Atlanteans walking at night was a clear example of the fixation of the second attention. I had arrived at that conclusion using the following set of premises. First, that we are not merely whatever our common sense requires us to believe we are. We are in actuality luminous beings capable of becoming aware of our luminosity. Second, that as luminous beings aware of our luminosity, we are capable of unraveling different facets of our awareness, or our attention, as Don Juan called it. Third, that the unraveling could be brought about by a deliberate effort as we were trying to do ourselves, or accidentally, through a bodily trauma. Fourth, that there had been a time when sorcerers deliberately placed different facets of their attention on material objects. Fifth, that the Atlanteans, judging by their awe-inspiring setting, must have been objects of fixation for sorcerers of another time. I said that the custodian who had given my friend the information had undoubtedly unraveled another facet of his attention. He might have unwittingly become, if only for a moment, a receptor for the projections of ancient sorcerers' second attention. It was not so far-fetched to me then that the man may have visualized the fixation of those sorcerers. If those sorcerers were members of Don Juan's and Don Gennaro's tradition, they must have been impeccable practitioners, in which case there would have been no limit to what they could accomplish with the fixation of their second attention. If they intended that the Atlanteans should walk at night, then the Atlanteans would walk at night. As I talked, the three little sisters became very angry and agitated with me. When I finished, Lydia accused me of doing nothing else but talking. Then they got up and left without even saying goodbye. The men followed them, but stopped at the door and shook hands with me. LaGorda and I remained in the room. "There is something very wrong with those women," I said. "No. They're just tired of talking," LaGorda said. "They expect some action from you." "How come the Gennaros are not tired of talking?" I asked. "They are more stupid than the women," she replied dryly. "How about you, Gorda?" I asked. "Are you also tired of talking?" "I don't know what I am," she said solemnly. "When I am with you, I'm not tired, but when I am with the little sisters, I'm dead tired just like them." During the following uneventful days that I stayed with them, it was obvious that the little sisters were thoroughly hostile to me. The Gennaros tolerated me in an offhand way. Only LaGorda seemed to be aligned with me. I began to wonder why. I asked her about it before I left for Los Angeles. "I don't know how it is possible, but I'm used to you," she said. "It's as if you and I are together, while the little sisters, the Gennaros, are in a different world. 2. Seeing together. For several weeks after my return to Los Angeles, I had a sense of mild discomfort which I explained away as a dizziness or a sudden loss of breath due to physical exertion. It reached a climax one night when I woke up terrified, unable to breathe. The physician I went to see diagnosed my trouble as hyperventilation, most likely caused by tension. He prescribed a tranquilizer and suggested breathing into a paper bag if the attack should ever occur again. I decided to return to Mexico to seek LaGorda's counsel. After I told her the doctor's diagnosis, she calmly assured me that no illness was involved, that I was finally losing my shields, and that what I was experiencing was the loss of my human form and the entrance into a new state of separation from human affairs. "Don't fight it," she said. "Our natural reaction is to struggle against it. In doing so, we dispel it. Let go of your fear and follow the loss of your human form step by step." She added that in her case, the disintegration of her human form began in her womb, with a severe pain and an inordinate pressure that shifted slowly in two directions, down her legs and up to her throat. She also said that the effects are felt immediately. I wanted to record every nuance of my entrance into that new state. I prepared myself to write down a detailed account of whatever took place, but to my utter chagrin, nothing more happened. After a few days of fruitless expectation, I gave up on LaGorda's explanation and concluded that the doctor had correctly diagnosed my condition. It was perfectly understandable to me. I was carrying a responsibility that generated unbearable tension. I had accepted the leadership that the apprentices believed belonged to me, but I had no idea how to lead. The pressure in my life also showed in a more serious way. My usual level of energy was dropping steadily. Don Juan would have said that I was losing my personal power, and that eventually I would lose my life. Don Juan had set me up to live exclusively by means of personal power, which I understood to be a state of being, a relationship of order between the subject and the universe, a relationship that cannot be disrupted without resulting in the subject's death. Since there was no foreseeable way to change my situation, I had concluded that my life was coming to an end. My feeling of being doomed seemed to infuriate all the apprentices. I decided to get away from them for a couple of days to dispel my gloom and their tension. When I came back, I found them standing outside the front door of the little sister's house, as if they had been waiting for me. Nestor ran to my car, and before I even turned the motor off, he blurted out that Pablito had run away. He had gone to die, Nestor said, in the city of Tula, the place of his ancestors. I was appalled. I felt guilty. Lagorda did not share my concern. She was beaming, exuding contentment. "That little pimp is better off dead," she said. "All of us are going to live together harmoniously now, as we should. The Nagwal told us that you were going to bring change into our lives. Well, you did. Pablito is not bugging us any longer. You got rid of him. Look how happy we are. We are better off without him." I was outraged by her callousness. I stated as forcefully as I could that Don Juan had given all of us, in a most painstaking manner, the format of a warrior's life. I stressed that the warrior's impeccability demanded that I not let Pablito die just like that. "And what do you think you're going to do?" Lagorda asked. "I'm going to take one of you to live with him," I said, "until the day when all of you, including Pablito, can move out of here." They laughed at me, even Nestor and Benigno, who I thought were closest to Pablito. Lagorda laughed longer than anyone else, obviously challenging me. I turned to Nestor and Benigno for moral support. They looked away. I appealed to Lagorda's superior understanding. I pleaded with her. I used all the arguments I could think of. She looked at me with utter contempt. "Let's get going," she said to the others. She gave me the most vacuous smile. She shrugged her shoulders and made a vague puckering gesture with her lips. "You're welcome to come with us," she said to me, "providing that you don't ask questions or talk about that little pimp." "You are a formless warrior, Gorda," I said. "You told me that yourself. Why, then, do you judge Pablito?" Lagorda did not answer. But she acknowledged the blow. She frowned and avoided my gaze. "Lagorda is with us," Josefina yelled in a high-pitched voice. The three little sisters gathered around Lagorda and pulled her inside the house. I followed them. Nestor and Benigno also went inside. "What are you going to do, take one of us by force?" Lagorda asked me. I told all of them that I considered it my duty to help Pablito, and that I would do the same for any one of them. "You really think you can pull this off?" Lagorda asked me, her eyes flaring with anger. I wanted to roar with rage as I had once done in their presence, but the circumstances were different. I could not do it. "I'm going to take Josefina with me," I said. "I am the Nagwal." Lagorda gathered the three little sisters and shielded them with her body. They were about to join hands. Something in me knew that if they did, their combined strength would have been awesome, and my efforts to take Josefina would have been useless. My only chance was to strike before they had a chance to group. I pushed Josefina with the palms of my hands and sent her reeling to the center of the room. Before they had time to regroup themselves, I hit Lydia and Rosa. They bent over with pain. Lagorda came at me with a fury I had never witnessed in her. It was like the attack of a savage beast. Her whole concentration was on a single thrust of her body. If she had struck me, I would have been killed. She missed my chest by inches. I grabbed her from behind in a bear hug and we tumbled down. We rolled over and over until we were utterly exhausted. Her body relaxed. She began to caress the back of my hands, which were tightly clasped around her stomach. I noticed then that Nestor and Benigno were standing by the door. They both seemed to be on the verge of becoming physically ill. Lagorda smiled shyly and whispered in my ear that she was glad I had overcome her. I took Josefina to Pablito. I had felt that she was the only one of the apprentices who genuinely needed someone to look after her, and Pablito resented her the least. I was sure that his sense of chivalry would force him to reach out to her, since she would be in need of help. A month later I returned once more to Mexico. Pablito and Josefina had returned. They were living together at Don Genero's house and shared it with Benigno and Rosa. Nestor and Lydia lived at Soledad's place, and Lagorda lived alone in the little sister's house. "Do our new living arrangements surprise you?" Lagorda asked. My surprise was more than evident. I wanted to know all the implications of this new organization. Lagorda let me know in a dry tone that there were no implications that she knew of. They had chosen to live in couples but not as couples. She added that, contrary to what I might think, they were impeccable warriors. The new format was rather pleasant. Everybody seemed to be completely relaxed. There was no more bickering or outbursts of competitive behavior among them. They had also taken to dressing in the Indian apparel typical of that region. The women wore dresses with full gathered skirts that almost touched the ground. They wore dark shawls and their hair in braids, except for Josefina, who always wore a hat. The men wore thin white pajama-like pants and shirts, and straw hats. All of them wore homemade sandals. I asked Lagorda the reason for their new way of dressing. She said that they were getting ready to leave. Sooner or later, with my helper by themselves, they were going to leave that valley. They would be going into a new world, a new life. When they did that, they would acknowledge the change. The longer they wore their Indian clothes, the more drastic the change would be when they put on city clothes. She added that they had been taught to be fluid, at ease in whatever situation they found themselves, and that I had been taught the same. My challenge was to deal with them with ease regardless of what they did to me. Their challenge in turn was to leave their valley and settle down elsewhere to find out if they could be as fluid as warriors should be. I asked for her honest opinion about our chances of succeeding. She said that failure was written all over our faces. Lagorda changed the subject abruptly and told me that in her dreaming, she had found herself staring at a gigantic narrow gorge between two enormous round mountains. She thought that the two mountains were familiar to her and wanted me to drive her to a nearby town. She believed, without knowing why, that the two mountains were located there and that the message from her dreaming was that both of us should go there. We left at the crack of dawn. I had driven through that town before. It was very small, and I had never noticed anything in its surroundings that even came close to Lagorda's vision. There were only eroded hills around it. It turned out that the two mountains were not there, or if they were, we could not find them. It was not a clear memory. I did not remember the streets or the houses. What I felt was a vague but strong apprehension that something was going to become clear in my mind. I was not sure what, a memory perhaps. At moments that vague apprehension became paramount, especially when I saw a particular house. I parked in front of it. LaGorda and I looked at it from the car for perhaps an hour. Yet neither of us suggested leaving the car to go into it. Both of us were very edgy. We began to talk about our vision of the two mountains. Our conversation soon turned into an argument. She thought I had not taken her dreaming seriously. Our tempers flared and we ended up yelling at each other, not so much out of anger as out of nervousness. I caught myself and stopped. On our way back, I parked the car on the side of the dirt road. We got out to stretch our legs. We walked for a while. It was too windy to enjoy it. LaGorda still seemed to be agitated. We went back to the car and sat inside. "If you would only rally your knowledge," LaGorda said in a pleading tone. "You would know that losing the human form." She stopped in mid-sentence. My frown must have brought her up short. She was cognizant of my struggle. If there was any knowledge in me that I could have consciously rallied, I would have done it already. "But we are luminous beings," she said in the same pleading tone. "There is so much more to us. You are the Nagwal. There is even more to you. What do you think I should do?" I asked. "You must let go of your desire to cling," she said. The very same thing happened to me. I held on to things, such as the food I liked, the mountains where I lived, the people I used to enjoy talking to, but most of all, I clung to the desire to be liked. I told her that her advice was meaningless to me, for I was not aware of holding on to anything. She insisted that somehow I knew that I was putting up barriers to losing my human form. "Our attention is trained to focus doggedly," she went on. "That is the way we maintain the world. Your first attention has been taught to focus on something that's quite strange to me, but very familiar to you." I told her that my mind dwells on abstractions, not abstractions like mathematics, for instance, but rather propositions of reasonableness. "Now is the time to let go of all that," she said. "In order to lose your human form, you should let go of all that ballast. You counterbalance so hard that you paralyze yourself." I was in no mood to argue. What she called losing the human form was a concept too vague for immediate consideration. I was concerned with what we had experienced in that town. LaGorda did not want to talk about it. "The only thing that counts is that you rally your knowledge," she said. "You can do it if you need to, like that day when Pablito ran away and you and I came to blows." LaGorda said that what had happened on that day was an example of rallying one's knowledge. Without being thoroughly aware of what I was doing, I had performed complex maneuvers which required seeing. "You did not just attack us," she said. "You saw." She was right, in a manner of speaking. Something quite out of the ordinary had taken place on that occasion. I had considered it in great detail, confining it, however, to purely personal speculation. I had no adequate explanation for it, outside of saying that the emotional charge of the moment had affected me in inconceivable ways. When I had stepped inside their house and faced the four women, I became aware in one split second that I was able to shift my ordinary way of perceiving. I saw four amorphous blobs of very intense amber light in front of me. One of them was more mellow, more pleasing. The other three were unfriendly, sharp, whitish amber glows. The mellow glow was LaGorda. And at that moment the three unfriendly glows were looming menacingly over her. The blob of whitish luminosity closest to me, which was Josefina, was a bit off balance. It was leaning over, so I gave it a push. I kicked the other two in a depression they each had on their right side. I had no conscious idea that I should kick them there. I simply found the indentation convenient. Somehow it invited me to put my foot in it. The result was devastating. Lydia and Rosa fainted on the spot. I had kicked each of them on their right thigh. It was not a kick that could have broken any bones. I only pushed the blobs of light in front of me with my foot. Nonetheless, it was as if I had given them a ferocious blow in the most vulnerable part of their bodies. Lagorda was right, I had rallied some knowledge I was not aware of. If that was called seeing, the logical conclusion for my intellect would be to say that seeing is a bodily knowledge. The predominance of the visual sense in us influences this bodily knowledge and makes it seem to be eye-related. What I experienced was not altogether visual. I saw the blobs of light with something else besides my eyes, since I was conscious that the four women were in my field of vision during the entire time I dealt with them. The blobs of light were not even superimposed on them. The two sets of images were separate. What complicated the issue for me was the matter of time. Everything was compressed into a few seconds. If I did shift from one scene to the other, the shift must have been so fast that it became meaningless. Thus I can only recall perceiving two separate scenes simultaneously. After I had kicked the two blobs of light, the mellow one Lagorda came toward me. It did not come straight at me, but angled to my left from the moment it started to move. It obviously intended to miss me, so when the glow passed by I grabbed it. As I rolled over and over on the floor with it, I felt I was melting into it. That was the only time I really lost a sense of continuity. I again became aware of myself while Lagorda was caressing the backs of my hands. In our dreaming, the little sisters and I have learned to join hands, Lagorda said. We know how to make a line. Our problem that day was that we had never made that line outside our room. That was why they dragged me inside. Your body knew what it meant for us to join hands. If we had done it, I would have been under their control. They are more fierce than I am. Their bodies are tightly sealed. They are not concerned with sex. I am. That makes me weaker. I'm sure that your concern with sex is what makes it very difficult for you to rally your knowledge. She went on talking about the debilitating effects of having sex. I felt ill at ease. I tried to steer the conversation away from that topic, but she seemed determined to go back to it regardless of my discomfort. Let you and I drive to Mexico City, I said in desperation. I thought I would shock her. She did not answer. She puckered her lips, squinting her eyes. She contracted the muscles of her chin, pushing her upper lip until it bulged under her nose. Her face became so contorted that I was taken aback. She reacted to my surprise and relaxed her facial muscles. Come on, Gorda, I said. Let's go to Mexico City. Sure. Why not? She said. What do I need? I did not expect that reaction and ended up shocked myself. Nothing, I said. We'll go as we are. Without saying another word, she slumped on the seat and we drove off toward Mexico City. It was still early, not even midday. I asked her if she would dare to go to Los Angeles with me. She was pensive for a moment. I've just asked my luminous body that question, she said. What did it say? It said only if power permits it. There was such a wealth of feeling in her voice that I stopped the car and hugged her. My affection for her at that moment was so deep that I got frightened. It had nothing to do with sex or the need of psychological reinforcement. It was a feeling that transcended everything I knew. Embracing Lagorda brought back the sense I had had earlier that something in me which was bottled up, pushed into recesses I could not consciously reach, was about to come out. I almost knew then what it was, but I lost it when I reached for it. Lagorda and I arrived in the city of Oaxaca in the early evening. I parked my car on a side street, and then we walked to the center of town to the plaza. We looked for the bench where Don Juan and Don Genaro used to sit. It was unoccupied. We sat there in reverent silence. Finally, Lagorda said that she had been there with Don Juan many times as well as with someone else she could not remember. She was not sure whether that was something she had merely dreamed. "What did you do with Don Juan on this bench?" I asked. "Nothing. We just sat waiting for the bus, or for the lumber truck that would give us a ride up the mountains," she replied. I told her that when I sat on that bench with Don Juan, we would talk for hours. I recounted for her the great predilection that he had for poetry, and how I used to read it to him when we had nothing else to do. He would listen to poems on the premise that only the first or sometimes the second stanza was worthwhile reading. The rest he found to be indulgence on the poet's part. There were very few poems, of the hundreds I must have read to him, that he listened to all the way through. At first I read to him what I liked. My preference was for abstract, convoluted, cerebral poetry. Later he made me read over and over what he liked. In his opinion, a poem had to be compact, preferably short, and it had to be made up of precise, poignant images of great simplicity. In the late afternoons, sitting on that bench in Oaxaca, a poem by Cesar Vallejo always seemed to sum up for him a special feeling of longing. I recited it to Lagorda from memory, not so much for her benefit as for mine. "I wonder what she is doing at this hour, my Andean and sweet Rita of reeds and wild cherry trees. Now that this weariness chokes me, and blood dozes off, like lazy brandy inside me. I wonder what she is doing with those hands that in attitude of penitence used to iron starchy whiteness in the afternoons. Now that this rain is taking away my desire to go on. I wonder what has become of her skirt with lace, of her toils, of her walk, of her scent of spring sugarcane from that place. She must be at the door, gazing at a fast-moving cloud. A wild bird on the tile roof will let out a call, and shivering she will say at last, 'Jesus, it's cold.'" The memory of Don Juan was incredibly vivid. It was not a memory on the level of my thought, nor was it on the level of my conscious feelings. It was an unknown kind of memory that made me weep. Tears were streaming from my eyes, but they were not soothing at all. The last hour of the afternoon had always had special significance for Don Juan. I had accepted his regard for that hour, and his conviction that if something of importance were to come to me, it would have to be at that time. Lagorda put her head on my shoulder. I rested my head on her head. We remained in that position for a while. I felt relaxed. The agitation had been driven away from me. It was strange that the single act of resting my head on Lagorda's would bring such peace. I wanted to make a joke and tell her that we should tie our heads together. Then I knew that she would actually take me up on that. My body shook with laughter, and I realized that I was asleep, yet my eyes were open. If I had really wanted to, I could have stood up. I did not want to move, so I remained there fully awake and yet asleep. I saw people walking by and staring at us. I did not mind that in the least. Ordinarily I would have objected to being noticed. Then all at once the people in front of me changed into very large blobs of white light. I was facing the luminous eggs in a sustained fashion for the first time in my life. Don Juan had told me that human beings appear to the seer as luminous eggs. I had experienced flashes of that perception, but never before had I focused my vision on them as I was doing that day. The blobs of light were quite amorphous at first. It was as if my eyes were not properly focused. But then, at one moment, it was as if I had finally arranged my vision, and the blobs of white light became oblong luminous eggs. They were big, in fact, they were enormous, perhaps 7 feet high by 4 feet wide or even larger. At one moment I noticed that the eggs were no longer moving. I saw a solid mass of luminosity in front of me. The eggs were watching me, looming dangerously over me. I moved deliberately and sat up straight. Lagorda was sound asleep on my shoulder. There was a group of adolescents around us. They must have thought that we were drunk. They were mimicking us. The most daring adolescent was feeling Lagorda's breasts. I shook her and woke her up. We stood up in a hurry and left. They followed us, taunting us and yelling obscenities. The presence of a policeman on the corner dissuaded them from continuing with their harassment. We walked in complete silence from the plaza to where I had left my car. It was almost evening. Suddenly Lagorda grabbed my arm. Her eyes were wild, her mouth open. She pointed. "Look. Look," she yelled. "There's the Nagual and Genero." I saw 2 men turning the corner a long block ahead of us. Lagorda took off in a fast run. Running after her, I asked her if she was sure. She was beside herself. She said that when she had looked up, both Don Juan and Don Genero were staring at her. The moment her eyes met theirs, they moved away. When we reached the corner ourselves, the 2 men were still the same distance away from us. I could not distinguish their features. They were dressed like rural Mexican men. They were wearing straw hats. One was husky, like Don Juan. The other was thin, like Don Genero. The 2 men went around another corner, and we again ran noisily after them. The street they had turned onto was deserted and led to the outskirts of town. It curved slightly to the left. The 2 men were just where the street curved. Right then something happened that made me feel it was possible they might really be Don Juan and Don Genero. It was a movement that the smaller man made. He turned 3/4 profile to us and tilted his head as if telling us to follow, something Don Genero used to do to me whenever we were out in the woods. He always walked ahead of me, daring, coaxing me with a movement of his head to catch up with him. Lagorda began to yell at the top of her voice. "Nagual. Genero. Wait." She ran ahead of me. They were walking very fast toward some shacks that were half visible in the semi-darkness. They must have entered one of them or turned into any of a number of pathways. Suddenly they were out of sight. Lagorda stood there and bellowed their names without any bashfulness. People came out to see who was yelling. I held her until she calmed down. "They were right in front of me," she said, crying. "Not even 10 feet away. When I yelled and called your attention to them, they were a block away in one instant." I tried to appease her. She was in a high state of nervousness. She clung to me shivering. For some indiscernible reason I was absolutely sure that the two men were not Don Juan and Don Gennaro, therefore, I could not share Lagorda's agitation. She said that we had to drive back home, that power would not permit her to go to Los Angeles, or even to Mexico City with me. It was not time yet for her journey. She was convinced that seeing them had been an omen. They had disappeared, pointing toward the east, toward her hometown. I did not have any objections to starting back that very moment. After all the things that had happened to us that day, I should have been dead tired. Instead, I was vibrating with a most extravagant vigor reminiscent of times with Don Juan, when I had felt like ramming walls with my shoulders. On our way back to my car, I was again filled with the most passionate affection for Lagorda. I could never thank her enough for her help. I thought that whatever she had done to help me see the luminous eggs had worked. She had been so courageous, risking ridicule and even bodily harm by sitting on that bench. I expressed my thanks to her. She looked at me as if I were crazy and then broke into a belly laugh. "I thought the same thing about you," she said. "I thought you had done it just for me. I too saw luminous eggs. This was the first time for me also. We have seen together. Like the Nagual and Gennaro used to do." As I opened the door of the car for Lagorda, the full impact of what we had done struck me. Up to that point I had been numb. Something in me had slowed down. Now my euphoria was as intense as Lagorda's agitation had been a short while before. I wanted to run in the street and shout. It was Lagorda's turn to contain me. She squatted and rubbed my calves. Strangely enough, I calmed down immediately. I found that it was difficult for me to talk. My thoughts were running ahead of my ability to verbalize them. I did not want to drive back to her hometown right away. There seemed to be still so much more to do. Since I could not explain clearly what I wanted, I practically dragged a reluctant Gorda back to the plaza, but there were no empty benches at that hour. I was famished, so I pulled her into a restaurant. She thought she could not eat, but when they brought the food she turned out to be as hungry as I was. Eating relaxed us completely. We sat on the bench later that night. I had refrained from talking about what happened to us until we had a chance to sit there. Lagorda was at first unwilling to say anything. My mind was in a peculiar state of exhilaration. I had had similar moments with Don Juan, but they were associated, as a rule, with the after-effects of hallucinogenic plants. I began by describing to Lagorda what I had seen. The feature of those luminous eggs that had impressed me the most was their movements. They did not walk. They moved in a floating manner, yet they were grounded. The way they moved was not pleasing. Their movements were stilted, wooden, and jerky. When they were in motion, the whole egg shape became smaller and rounder. They seemed to jump or jerk, or shake up and down with great speed. The result was a most annoying nervous shivering. Perhaps the closest I can get to describing the physical discomfort caused by their motion would be to say that I felt as if the images on a moving picture screen had been speeded up. Another thing that had intrigued me was that I could not detect any legs. I had once seen a ballet production in which the dancers mimicked the movement of soldiers on ice skates. For that effect, they wore loose tunics that hung all the way to the floor. There was no way to see their feet, thus the illusion that they were gliding on ice. The luminous eggs that paraded in front of me gave the impression that they were sliding on a rough surface. Their luminosity shook up and down almost imperceptibly, yet enough to make me nearly ill. When the eggs were in repose, they became elongated. Some of them were so long and rigid that they brought to mind the idea of a wooden icon. Another even more disturbing feature of the luminous eggs was the absence of eyes. I had never realized so acutely how we are drawn to the eyes of living beings. The luminous eggs were thoroughly alive. They were observing me with great curiosity. I could see them jerking up and down, leaning over to watch me, but without any eyes. Many of those luminous eggs had black spots on them, huge spots below the midsection. Others did not. Lagorda had told me that reproduction affects the bodies of both men and women by causing a hole to appear below the stomach, but the spots on those luminous eggs did not seem like holes to me. They were areas with no luminosity, but there was no depth to them. Those that had the black spots seemed to be mellow, tired. The crest of their egg shape was wilted. It looked opaque in comparison to the rest of their glow. The ones without spots, on the other hand, were dazzlingly bright. I fancied them to be dangerous. They were vibrant, filled with energy and whiteness. Lagorda said that the instant I rested my head on her, she also entered into a state that resembled dreaming. She was awake, yet she could not move. She was conscious that people were milling around us. Then she saw them turning into luminous blobs and finally into egg-shaped creatures. She did not know that I was also seeing. She had thought at first that I was watching over her, but at one moment the pressure of my head was so heavy that she concluded quite consciously that I too must have been seeing. Only after I straightened up and caught the young man fondling her as she seemed to sleep, did I have an inkling of what might be happening to her. Our visions differed in that she could distinguish men from women by the shape of some filaments that she called roots. Women, she said, had thick bundles of filaments that resembled a lion's tail. They grew inward from the place of the genitalia. She explained that those roots were the givers of life. The embryo, in order to accomplish its growth, attaches itself to one of those nurturing roots and thoroughly consumes it, leaving only a hole. Men, on the other hand, had short filaments that were alive and floating almost separately from the luminous mass of their bodies. I asked her what in her opinion was the reason we had seen together. She declined to make any comment, but she coaxed me to go ahead with my speculations. I told her that the only thing that occurred to me was the obvious: emotions must have been a factor. After Lagorda and I had sat down on Don Juan's favorite bench in the late afternoon, and I had recited the poem that he liked, I was highly charged with emotion. My emotions must have prepared my body. But I also had to consider the fact that from doing dreaming, I had learned to enter into a state of total quietness. I was able to turn off my internal dialogue and remain as if I were inside a cocoon, peeking out of a hole. In that state I could either let go of some control I had and enter into dreaming, or I could hold on to that control and remain passive, thoughtless, and without desires. I did not think, however, that those were the significant factors. I believed the catalyst was Lagorda. I thought it was what I felt for her which had created the conditions for seeing. Lagorda laughed shyly when I told her what I believed. "I don't agree with you," she said. "I think what has happened is that your body has started to remember." "What do you mean by that, Gorda?" I asked. There was a long pause. She seemed to be either fighting to say something she did not want to say, or she was desperately trying to find the appropriate word. "There are so many things that I know," she said, And yet I don't know what I know. I remember so many things that I finally end up remembering nothing. I think you are in the same predicament yourself. I assured her that I was not aware of it. She refused to believe me. At times I really believe you don't know, she said. At other times I believe you are playing with us. The Nagwal told me that he himself didn't know. A lot of things that he told me about you are coming back to me now. What does it mean that my body has begun to remember? I insisted. Don't ask me that, she said with a smile. I don't know what you are supposed to remember, or what that remembering is like. I've never done it myself. I know that much. Is there anybody among the apprentices who could tell me? I asked. No one, she said. I think I'm a courier to you, a courier who can bring you only half a message this time. She stood up and begged me to drive her back to her hometown. I was too exhilarated to leave then. We walked around the plaza at my suggestion. Finally we sat down on another bench. Isn't it strange to you that we could see together with such ease? Lagorda asked. I did not know what she had in mind. I was hesitant in answering. What would you say if I told you that I think we've seen together before? Lagorda asked, carefully voicing her words. I could not understand what she meant. She repeated the question one more time, and I still could not get her meaning. When could we have seen together before? I asked. Your question doesn't make sense. That's the point, she replied. It doesn't make sense, and yet I have the feeling we have seen together before. I felt a chill and stood up. I remembered again the sensation I had had in that town. Lagorda opened her mouth to say something but stopped herself in mid-sentence. She stared at me, bewildered, put her hand to my lips, and then practically dragged me to the car. I drove all night. I wanted to talk, to analyze, but she fell asleep as if purposely avoiding any discussion. She was right, of course. Of the two of us, she was the one who was cognizant of the danger of dissipating a mood through overanalyzing it. When we arrived at her house, as she got out of the car she said that we could not talk at all about what happened to us in Oaxaca. Why is that, Gorda? I asked. I don't want to waste our power, she said. That's the sorcerer's way. Never waste your gains. But if we don't talk about it, we'll never know what really happened to us, I protested. We have to keep quiet for at least 9 days, she said. Can we talk about it just between the two of us? I asked. A talk between the two of us is precisely what we must avoid, she said. We're vulnerable. We must allow ourselves time to heal. And that's not all. Our experts and regular viewers respond to all comments. Also check if you forgot to subscribe and set your bell to receive notifications about new audiobooks and other useful self-development materials that we release regularly. Join in the discussions, don't forget to give likes and, if possible and inspired, support the development of the channel financially. All useful links will be in the description and the first attached comment. Goodness, love and wisdom to all. And now move on to watch the next part of the video at the links below, or choose something from the playlists of the channel and those you see on the screen.